The Rings of Power. This video was supposed to be 10 minutes long covering episode 1, but Lenny Henry and the creators behind Rings of Power annoyed me so much it ballooned into 3 videos. Every time I think about this show, I think of more things that are wrong with it. Where were we? At the Harfords. What's going on with the Harfords? This is Nori Brandyfoot, and she'll be our female Frodo for the series. This is her father and her mother. At first, I thought I'd misheard when they said that in the show. I'm going to have to stop the show there. This is supposed to be her mother and father. How has this mother had a baby girl of a different race that shares no characteristics with her own mother? Is it her biological mother? Is it her stepmother? For this male and this female to have this daughter, maybe Harfoot genetics are quite different to human, because she seems to have no genetic traits from her own mother. How do Harfoot genetics work? Is this how they manage to be both insular and reclusive, never meeting outsiders and yet still look like the United Nations? Do 2 Caucasian Harfoots breed and then 9 months later a baby looking like Lenny Henry pops out, to the confusion of both parents, and then when the baby first talks it has an accent like Michael Holding?
Everything should be taught. When you go back through the schooling as a young man, I remember my school days. I was never taught anything good about black people. And you cannot have a society that is brought up like that, both white and black, that only teach what's convenient.
It's like the Obamas having a child and a baby me popping out, much to the confusion of both Barack and Michelle. Now, up until this point, I'd had assumed that Hobbit or Harfoot reproduction was much like human. You see, when a mummy and a daddy Hobbit love each other very much, it gets very dark. Now, I looked into it and I found out. I'm not going to expound on the Harfoot mating ritual. It'd get me banned from YouTube. It's complete filth. But it suffices to say that it involves both blackberries and snails. What even is the length of Harfoot gestation? 9 months? Or did the babies pop out in the time it takes to cook microwave popcorn? How many of them are there in this group? Troop? What is the mass noun for Harfoots? How many of them are there? Maybe 50? And they have no contact with the outside world at all? That's not even enough to maintain a healthy population in terms of genetics. They'd be as inbred as the Targaryens from Game of Thrones. Is it magic again? Because with a population of 50, you'd be lucky if the babies didn't come out with prehensile webbed toes and a beak. You'd end up like the Wrong Turn movies. Now, I do occasionally recommend other media, so if you've never watched the Wrong Turn movies, I wouldn't bother. I had plenty of time to think about all this in the time I spent watching, but not enjoying the Rings of Power. Half an hour and 3 videos, and I'm not even done with episode 1. Is that how it works? Are Harfoots just genetically very unstable? Does every 10th Harfoot baby come out looking like a cross between this and this? That would at least explain why the 2 humans at the start were scared of Harfoots and telling horror stories about them. Are they voracious predators like the Skaven from Warhammer, hungry for man-flesh? Is that what the Balrog was, just a severely mutated Harfoot baby? Anyway, enough about that. It's high time I get back to the Lenny Henry rant. So, Lenny now pops up in the UK media once a year or so to lament the continued existence of white people. Like in this article, titled, "Our TV shows are far too white," says Lenny Henry. Comedian attacks hit shows, including Broadchurch and Miranda. The problem with this narrative is that there's no way to win. When white writers don't write black characters into their shows, it's proof of their racism for being exclusionary. And when they do write non-white characters into their shows, they get accused of appropriation, and therefore that's also proof of their racism. There's just no way to win, and someone will always be trying to make money, even if it means sowing racial division. Take the BBC show Luther as an example. In Luther, starring Idris Elba, the writer had initially envisaged Luther as a white police officer. The BBC requested the author change the character to a black police officer because the BBC wanted more representation in their programming. The writer acquiesced, as he thought the change made minimal difference to the content of the show. This didn't, however, stop the BBC show coming under criticism from the BBC and their own diversity chief, who said, Idris Elba's TV detective Luther isn't black enough to be real because he doesn't have any black friends and doesn't eat any Caribbean food. Like that's the only authentic or possible way for a black person to exist in the United Kingdom. And I'm sure the image of Luther spending the end of every episode eating jerk chicken with his black friends wouldn't have come in for any criticism. What is this narrative? And why do people like Lenny need to see themselves represented to enjoy a piece of media? Why can't they empathise with people of a different skin colour? And I don't buy into this argument for a second. I must have watched Enter the Dragon 100 times. I don't look like Bruce Lee. I'm not from Hong Kong. I'm not ethnically Chinese. I can empathise with him just fine. I can empathise with Ripley from Aliens, despite not being a woman and not being a fish out of water in the future. I watched Blade plenty of times and enjoyed it. I don't look like Wesley Snipes. I'm neither black nor a vampire. I love Chewbacca despite not being a Wookiee. I can empathise with Frodo Baggins despite not being a 3-foot-tall hobbit. I can empathise with Bigwig from Watership Down despite not being a rabbit. But Lenny Henry can't empathise with John Nettles from the Midsummer Murders. He can't watch the Midsummer Murders because it's too white. He can't manage to watch something without seeing himself represented, and this is just narcissism. I think that's frankly a you problem, Lenny. The creatives on Rings of Power stressed that representation was needed in order that Lord of the Rings looked like the real world. What real world are they looking at? I've seen the real world. There's no Balrogs, no orcs, no elves of colour, no female dwarves of colour. Since when has looking like the real world ever been a standard that fantasy has to abide by? Krull didn't look like the real world. Why would fantasy have to look like modern day Britain? Why not modern day USA? Why not modern day Japan? Why not modern day Nigeria? Why not whatever the hell the author wants? So instead of full creative freedom, we're now told that it's just writers asking, what if? But the what ifs they're allowed to ask have to be between very narrow criteria dictated to them by activists. If your takeaway from the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films was, I couldn't get into them because there were too many white people, then sorry, I have news for you, you're probably a racist. Can you imagine the response if John Nettles or another white actor came out into the news and said the problem with shows like Desmond's or The Cosby Show is that they're just too black? But we maintain this double standard on the basis of skin colour. If this actor had gone to say, the problem with me watching The Cosby Show is that although the main cast, the Huxtable family, were all black and therefore the cast is clearly very diverse, I just didn't see myself represented in the show. At least one of the Huxtable's children should have been white. This just doesn't have the makeup of modern day UK. So why did Amazon do it? For some diversity, equity and inclusion points? Possibly. My best guess is that they were trying to generate some cheap heat when they realised how boring their show was, or possibly as a way of deflecting criticism down the line. Galadriel goes back to the Elven capital with her men, and that is Elrond. What have they done to Elrond? I don't even recognise him as the same guy as Hugo Weaving was playing.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Galadriel warns everyone at the Elven capital that Sauron is alive, and none of the men will believe her. So she's clearly going to be right. You go, girl! Galadriel wants to fight on and carry on tracking down Sauron, but the King of the Elves gives her a package holiday back to the Elven continent of Valinor instead. Elrond tries to convince Galadriel to go against her objections, saying, "It is said that the wine of victory is the sweetest for those in whose bitter trials it is fermented." My God, this dialogue is so bad. I just cringe through it. Galadriel gets on the ship, but changes her mind at the last minute, jumping into the sea to probably drown in bad CGI water. Anyone in reality would be dead, but she'll be just fine, and she couldn't have changed her mind sooner when she was right next to the coast. Elsewhere, a comet falls to Earth near the Harfords, as a hairy man in his underpants crashes to Earth like a Led Zeppelin. It's probably Gandalf, and he's found by the Harfords, so he better wake up before he's eaten alive. And that's it for episode 1. It's bad, and it's probably going to get worse.